I'm very, very pleased to have Tim with me today. The friendship that we've had over the years has really endured. In fact, in 2019, we tested it to its limits by having the Polyglot Conference together in Fukuoka, his hometown in Japan. And it was just a wonderful experience. And I think if you can go through organizing a conference together and come out friends, I think it says quite a lot about the friendship. And definitely that's the case. Not to say that I've fallen out with any of the other people I've organized conferences with before. Certainly not the case. But we had a good laugh.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, our friendship started way before any Polyglot Conference, because you remember we were shooting for an academic conference to do, and it didn't work out because it was a political thing. And then you decided you would start the conference series.
Yeah, that was it, right? You had invited me and Luca to go. And,
yes,
and
also
they didn't
right,
want
and also Robert in Austria. Yeah.
Oh, Robert Bigler as well.
Yeah.
Now it's all coming back. Yeah, my mind's a little bit foggy on all of the details. Yours is probably
2011.
Yours is definitely much sharper. So congratulations. But yeah, I remember they weren't so keen on mixing non-academic with academic.
No. That wasn't the reason. The reason was because they only had one session, gosh, the word in English is not coming to me. It was an S, it's not seminar. At the conference, they only had one panel. It's called a panel discussion. They only had one, and everybody on it was from that university that was holding the conference. It was very political. It was, I publish or perish, and we're putting in the conference zone for you, so let's, fill all the slots with our people.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so it was academics from a specific university, and it was political.
Yeah.
So as I say, my memory of it is a bit foggy, but I'm glad you're here to jog it. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean that's the general relationship between the polyglot community and the academic community, and that studies foreign language acquisition. I'd say that it's really mixed situation. I mean, many of the people in the field, these English speakers, are monolinguals. And you can tell from their writing. Noam Chomsky was a monolingual. Steven Pinker, Noam Chomsky is a monolingual, still keen. And Steven Pinker, other people like that. And you can tell from their writings.
It's interesting because there are a number of people in academia who are extremely open and welcoming to speaking to people in the language learning community, particularly those who are interested in a number of languages. And I mean, we had the delightful Stephen Krashen speaking of today. He was just a wonderful person to have. I think at any event, let alone this kind of event, but he's just such a fun person to have around.
But he's into languages. He's as he was saying, he's like us. He is us. We are.
And there, over the years since all of that happened and the Polyglot Conference started, I've seen an increasing amount of interest from academia in this community, and certainly with studies and people interested in sort of how that works, whether it's from neuroscience type point of view, or just multiple language acquisition, whether from childhood right through to adulthood. A number of people have been in touch, and over the years.
Definitely there are people who are like that. I was just indicating that it's not, you would figure that people in the field would just love to talk to somebody who has been studying a number of languages, using a number of languages, especially learned as an adult, etc. But it's not always the case.
Yeah, my perception of it is as it's grown, and I don't know if it's grown because the community's grown and therefore the ability to reach out to a community that now exists that didn't really exist in the same way before.
Mm.
So with the chicken or the egg,
More accessible,
yeah,
more accessible for sure.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
that's
don't know if
true.
it's a chicken or an egg scenario, but
Right.
certainly I perceive the interest more than I could before because I wasn't anywhere near that kind of that kind of environment. But
Hmm.
with the conference having and welcoming and wanting more academics as well as language learning enthusiasts as well as language professionals, I think
Hmm.
uniting all of those different and diverse facets of the language learning community. I think it's really good because we get to learn from each other. And
Yeah, yeah. Well, basically, in our little discussion right now, I started off by saying, okay, this didn't work in 2011, and then you've indicated what's happened over the last 11 years in a more positive direction.
yeah,
Right.
and you yourself, you've married these two yourself
Yeah,
successfully.
and I mean, for those who don't know, I'm professor in Japan. Um, my field is cross-cultural management or international human resource management, but I specialize in researching foreign language acquisition and culture adaptation, because it's a very important part of international human resource management. In other words, your international human resources need to be able to adapt to foreign cultures and communicate. So I take a look at this attitudinal and psychological factors which facilitate or make it easier for somebody to learn foreign languages or adapt to the culture, fit right in. I always look at the two together, adapting to the culture and acquiring the language, because I think when somebody imitates well a native speaker, acts like a native speaker, or acts like people in that community, their behavior, not just the linguistically, but there's just the general behavior, the way they interact with people, their social norms, and then of course the communicative norms, the body language, and their speech patterns, etc. The closer they are to that community, usually the better they sound in that language. And when I say better they sound more like a native. I'm not getting into the argument, you really have to try to sound like a native in your prosody and your accent, etc. That's up to you. People have various opinions, but it facilitates communication. Communication is always facilitated when you are communicating in the same way as people, are used to.
Yeah, there are certainly linguistic communities where there's a higher.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Did you hear everything I said, or with
Yeah,
bad connection?
yeah. If I was speaking over you, that wasn't my intention. I wanted to just agree that there are certainly linguistic communities where they're not used to hearing wide varieties of differing accents, pronunciation to their own. And so learning a way or a fashion of speaking that's as close as possible to what their ears are used to or attuned to listening out for is not something that's necessarily just desirable potentially for some learners, but actually necessary for communication to take place. And I think when we think of the idea of this native level or sounding accent, it's like you say, it's fraught with many questions. It's quite a prickly subject, and people have their own motivations and reasons for wanting or not wanting that, or not agreeing or agreeing with that type of terminology. And that's a completely separate issue, as you rightly said. I think there are definitely some languages that are not studied as commonly, where an outside accent from the territories where that language is spoken is not common, and therefore it definitely does impede understanding.
Yeah, I think it also demonstrates a certain affinity. You know, you have an affinity towards that culture and those people. Like even like in the case of Spanish, Castellano, there are many, many ways to speak the language, just like English. And personally, I usually choose Cuban way, Cubano, because that's what I grew up with, or Colombian way, because that's where I went to university in Bogota. But I've been all around South America, and I can imitate Porteño to a certain extent, and I didn't spend as much time there. And I find that when I adapt the way I speak to the person I'm speaking to, if I'm speaking to a Colombian, they feel much closer than if I spoke in a different way. It's like, you know, it's the same in any language. I mean, if you're monolingual and you know, your hometown boys, you know.
Well, I think from a speaker's point of view, there are certain assumptions that are made depending on how people speak. So, for example, if somebody came and they audibly learnt English in the United Kingdom as opposed to the United States, there are certain assumptions to their cultural awareness that an English speaker from the United Kingdom might make over somebody who'd learnt English from the United States, Canada,
Definitely.
New Zealand, or South Africa, or somewhere else.
Yeah.
So
we make many assumptions by the way people speak.
Yeah,
it's natural.
We do indeed, and it's let's say it's a very complex topic when it comes to which way of speaking is desirable for individuals, and what's taught and how it's taught, and how far we go down that road is always up for debate, I think. Over the years, you've explored many different languages from many different families. Are there any of these languages that particularly stand out to you as you really had to work on your pronunciation, articulation, accent, even, to make sure that you were understood, and it really did prove to be problematic?
English. Yeah. I mean, I've written about it before, I talked about it before, because in the case of English, as a young child, I had to go to speech therapy. And if I have to watch myself, I don't articulate in English, but I articulate well in other languages. There's a long story behind that, and I write about that in the first chapter of my book. That will be coming out later this year. But yeah, and I still have to watch myself in English, my mother tongue. But yeah, for pronunciation, the tough ones, okay, Zulu, number one, but I don't speak Zulu well. I'm very much of a beginner, just got into it, and I haven't been into it lately. But for a language that I speak well, it was tough to get into, would be Vietnamese. And let's not get into that joke about that. Yeah, it's Vietnamese, and because I learned both northern and southern ways of speaking, the tones, the vowels, etc. So far as tonal languages, first it was Chinese, and then I learned Thai, and Thai was more challenging in terms of tones, and then Vietnamese is the next level up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then another tough one is Tibetan. Also, the sounds in Tibetan getting the it's not so much the tones in the language, but just the overall phonology.
I mean, how used are some of these people to hearing a different accent? For example, I'm guessing Tibetan isn't as used to people, for example, in Vietnam.
Tibetans. Well, in Tibetan, there's many ways of speaking Tibetan too. So you have three main ways of speaking Tibetan, and like Amdo Tibetan is it's incomprehensible for somebody who hadn't had contact with them much. If they're from Lhasa, for example, or Kham, would be also incomprehensible. It depends on somebody's background, how much interaction they've had. And once they can see what's going on, you know, in terms of the rules of pronunciation, it's like for literature, the literary Tibetan hadn't changed, you know, for thousands of years. So in Com, for example, they'll pronounce a certain part of the written word is not pronounced in standard Udang Tibetan, which tends to be actually the shortest. There's many letters that are not pronounced, like Chashidile is much longer than what it sounds like. Chashidile is, you know, it's like 15 syllables if you really broke it down. And if you ever look at transcriptions of Romanized transcriptions of Tibetan, you're going to see letters which you don't hear at all. And that what they're doing is they're transcribing what's actually written there and not the pronunciation. So it's a tough one to transcribe because you have to choose. The same would happen if you did that in Thai, for example, because like if you write the T and R and AP, you would write TRAP, but actually it's pronounced sa. It's just the way it's pronounced when you're in that word, for example. Okay, so yeah.
I mean, the languages that you've studied over the years, which ones have you really felt that you've got into and really? I mean, obviously Japanese, I'm guessing, is the one that's
the longest, 42 years.
Yeah. Are there any that compare to Japanese?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not always just a length of time. If you are you talking about in terms of what levels you reach in passive and active,
I'm not
speaking and writing and reading? What are you talking about?
The level's not so important necessarily of the actual language, as we're talking about sort of what
the feeling.
Now. I'm talking about sort of living through a language to the extent that you've lived through Japanese. Are there any languages?
Well, yeah.
Compared to?
Sure. Okay. So Spanish, of course, for me, because you know, growing up with it and then going to school in Colombia and then traveling all around South America and then continuing to interact with people in the language over the years would be a strong one. Portuguese, funny enough, I've only been to Brazil twice for a total of about 3 to 4 my whole life, but I've read all the works of Jorge Amado, and I've listened to thousands and thousands of hours of Brazilian music. Mainly, this is from the artists from the 70s and the 80s, or even the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But it's very close to my heart. And, you know, I guess one real long is Polish, because 2 years living in Poland. And so that was pretty intense. It was 79 to 81 so we didn't watch TV. We didn't have a TV in the dorm. If we did, it wasn't interesting. And of course, you know, no computers and all that, and didn't have your telephones get in the way. So every day after classes, we'd sit in the dorm and just BS all the time. Sometimes it was serious philosophy. Sometimes it was gossip, you know, just anything. So, but the main form of entertainment was conversation.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was perhaps the heaviest. I mean, it was a language, Polish was a language where in the second year, I passed as a Pole, at least the first part of conversations when I met people, because I was really acting like a Pole. I felt really Polish. Yeah, more so than the other Slavic language. My first was Serbo-Croatian, time with Tito and traveling around there. And second was Russian, being in the Soviet Union 3 times all over. But then, you know, Polish took over. So, yeah, so I guess my closest Slavic language, closest to my being. Yeah, and then then there's many other languages which, you know, would follow after that. Yeah. Chinese was an important one for me also, because I studied Chinese literature in Japan, and then I traveled in China a lot, and then I taught in Taipei, and I taught in Shanghai, management related courses using Chinese. Yeah.
And one of the things that you just mentioned there about the times of when you were in some of these places studying the languages, living through the languages, 79 to 81 without the internet, without TV in the same way that we have today. Have you noticed a shift in the way you study from back then to now with the advancement in technology?
Yeah. Well, what exists now, I only dreamed about. So actually, when I was writing a chapter about my time in Switzerland when I was studying a program at the United Nations there, in the secretariats there, doing research in international relations, living in Geneva, Saconnet. And at that time, I dreamed of a world where I could go into this big room and there would be, a magic screen, and I could just ask it questions and it would tell me things. And I could, ask it questions about language, and I want to hear this language or that language, and etc. And I saw this got to occur someday, and then we have it right at our fingertips now. We even carry it in our pocket, right? So that was pretty unimaginable back then. I think when you grow up with the internet and all this interconnectedness, you can just shut it out. So it can be extremely helpful, but those growing up with this technology, it's all to do with your attitude, your curiosity. Because some people, they're surrounded by a number of languages, but they only really focus on their own.
Was there a rediscovery point for you then with the advent of technology, living in a place like Japan? And Japan is one of the countries that I would always describe as it has a dominant language, Japanese. And yes, there are obviously variations of Japanese, but and look in the North, Ainu potentially as an indigenous language but you're not going to come into contact with very often living in a place like Fukuoka or even many other parts of Japan. It is very much Japanese and a little bit more Japanese. But with the advent of the internet and having access to all of these countries again, was there a reawakening for you of any languages or countries in particular?
Okay, so before I answer that question, I have to say that at the university, I always had a lot of foreign students, and mainly from Asia. So for its Asian languages, I attracted a lot of the foreign students into my seminar. At times, my seminars were very large. Some professors would only have 2 to 3 people. I had up to 30 at times, because I accepted most people who applied. And some years I had only foreigners in my seminar, and then some years I just had 1 or 2 Japanese. I mean, they would be like at most 10%, and it varied. And so I had a lot of contact with Asian languages all the time, and so that really helped for my study there. And it started to expand. It was mainly Chinese at first, and Korean, then more from Vietnam, and Vietnam and Nepal are very big in terms of sending students to Japan nowadays, and the rest of Southeast Asia, South Asia, etc. Okay, so yeah, I would say that because of the internet and because I had opportunity to go to a conference in Spetses in Greece, I studied Greek. They put about 500 hours into it, and I was able to do it in a way that would normally couldn't be done, back in the old days. In other words, using a lot of media and such. I know it's very interesting because the first time I spoke Greek was on a plane flying there. I spoke Greek to somebody, and I had already studied, up to an advanced level, but that doesn't mean I could speak at advanced level at all, or necessarily have the passive understanding of advanced level. I could in the material that I studied, obviously. Same with Afrikaans. I did the same with Afrikaans that way. In the case of Afrikaans, I watched a few fake cook palais, which is the fake cook, the fat cakes. The Fat Cake Palace is a series, So I was able to watch a lot of media and get used to the language that way. Now I don't know if I answered. You said rekindle or such. Maybe I'm not answering you correctly.
Yeah, sort of. My. I mean, I like what you described, because obviously Japan is a sort of very Japanese. I mean, I know that sounds ridiculous to say, but you know what I mean when I say it.
Monocultural, monolingual.
Yeah, it's very Japan is very Japanese. But it is interesting that you put that extra context around it for your specific situation, which does change things. Even, you know, before the advent of the internet, that would make a difference, of course.
Yeah.
But with the advent of the internet, there are going to be cultures and languages that would reawaken, I'm guessing, because otherwise it would have been just books, really, or things you had with you in language, or radio.
Well, I was able to, I was able to then watch media to bring languages back to me. So Slavic languages in particular. So there's certain languages which, without much input over the years, I pop right back into them easily, usually, like Spanish or Portuguese or Polish. There are certain ones where I struggle. So it's good to hear it again and you know, fire up the engines again, get that. You know, it's like priming the pump, right? You'll have it in you, but it has to be primed down, you know?
Yeah.
And so the more listening you do, the more studying you do, it brings that former knowledge back to you. And so you know, I've been studying as an adult for 48 years. I think, you know, that's, so in the Polyglot community, I'm very impressed by people younger than me who achieve so much. And I mean, Richard, even you're almost 20 years younger than me. I would think something, I forget exactly. You're in your 40s, right? Early 40s. Yeah. Okay. So 20 something years younger, I could be your daddy.
Said in the wrong context, that sounds very wrong.
Said in the wrong context. Okay, cross that one out. I'm at the age where it would be physically possible and socially okay. But yeah, so you know, at age 18, I only spoke English and Spanish, and so then when I started studying at University in Columbia, I studied French, German, and Portuguese. You know, at Alliance Française, Institut de Cultura do Brasil, and then Goethe Institute, and then, of course, you know, studying in Spanish literature at the University of Literature and Politics. Yep. And so that's when it really took off. I mean, you know, people ask about studying more than one language at any given time. Yeah, it started off that way. I mean, when I got serious about it at age 18. So I was, you know, studying those three, but again, Spanish, my second language, but not my native language. Okay, so I mean, I grew up with around me studying at an early age, using it at an early age, and I'm talking about from 6 years on. But yeah, so I also found it very useful to study a foreign language in a foreign language that way, and then just, you know, took off from there. Yeah, because okay. So my point is bringing things back. So I got 48 years of, you know, that knowledge and experience to me, which, you know, in certain situations for certain language, you know, has to be primed out again, bring it back to the surface. Sometimes it's automatic, sometimes it's not. Sometimes I draw a blank. Yeah, and obviously you've also lived some of these cultures and languages at very different times. So when you could get access to them online after having lived and spent time in some countries, I mean, let's take Poland, for example. You were in Poland when it was still under the Iron Curtain. And I was there during Solidarność, the birth of Solidarność, and I witnessed it. Actually, I came in from Sweden to Swinoujście when they were on strike in Gdansk. Yeah.
Wow. I've been to the museum in Gdansk. It's amazing.
I experienced that.
You experienced it firsthand. But I mean, like Poland, and it could be Poland that's probably the biggest change for you.
Mm.
which rediscovery of a language and culture has been the biggest change in terms of how it's moved on and changed and developed?
What I just said, wow, why are they talking like that? What does this mean? When I first said Shema, I said, what in hell does that mean? Yeah, this is a new term, for chesh, jak się masz, the Shema, shortened, right? Bardzo krótkie jest, ale to jest bardzo dziwne, bo ja nie powiedziałem, co to jest? I said, what is that? I didn't understand. I was watching a series on Netflix. I said, why do they keep saying Shema? What does that mean?
So yeah, I mean, there's some linguistic, because obviously think languages change and evolve and move forward. Languages are not things that are static. They move on. And it struck me as curious to hear you talking about the time that you were in Poland, for example, and then all of a sudden you're in Japan. Okay, I mean, I'm fast forwarding, obviously, but then the internet comes about, and this country, Poland, that would have been difficult for you to get to from a place like Japan, would have been difficult to have the contact that you had previously. I was just curious as to how that would feel again, going back.
Okay, but one thing I did have that contact. Part of it, I said, I was in the Soviet Union 3 times. The first time was before in '78. Before I stayed in Poland, and then the second time was on the way to Poland to visit again. That was 1981, and then the third time was coming back, and then that time, then I visited 9 republics. Besides. The ones in the West. I was in Croatia, Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on. And so I had that contact. That was the last time. Okay, so the internet came, and then it was. I think I went back to Poland for a conference. In 2010. So from around mid 1980s to that time, I had no contact, and I still haven't been to Russia. I only know the Soviet Union. I don't know Russia today.
Wow, see, that's a huge changes in these parts of the world.
And I know the DDR. Well, I also know East Germany. Yeah.
I mean, just to sort of the reason why I asked this question and why I came back to it a couple of times was I spent time in Czech Republic from 2001, and then I went back in 2004, and then I went back again in 2010, I think it was. And each time there was like a huge change. That was just within a 9-year period. And so, I mean, Prague was a completely different city. To what I remembered in 2001.
Yeah.
It was it was beautiful, but it was fairly run down and in 2001. And it wasn't what it is today. What people go to.
I've been to Eastern Europe, but thanks to the Polyglot gathering, and going to Slovakia, and then those trips around that, and then Berlin, and then also in the conference in Slovenia and such. And then I made some extra travel around there. So I've been back through Eastern Europe, Central Europe, whatever you want to call it. Excuse me if you want to call it Central, and I use Eastern. But I had extensive experience in that area, during the Soviet bloc times. So I spent much more time, even though I went to school in Switzerland and I worked in Germany. I traveled around Western Europe. I spent more time in the so-called Soviet bloc, and Yugoslavia. Really wasn't part of it, but Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, that time Czechoslovakia and Poland, and then Belarus and Ukraine. So I spent more time in that area than I did in the West, and that's to talk about changes. The greatest changes were in those countries.
I have to ask, because people often ask about difficulty of language, learning a language. And what's the most difficult language? It's one of the most commonly asked questions.
Well, I always address that.
I was just going to say, what from your learning and your journey, what's been the most difficult for you? Right.
Okay. So everybody knows that difficulty depends on what your native tongue is and what languages you know well. I usually address that in three ways. I say, okay, let's look at, for example, the written language. So that's easy. It's very objective. Obviously, Japanese and Chinese are the hardest to write. And I would say, being able to read and write both, I say Japanese is harder than Chinese because you have to learn many more pronunciations for single character, character combinations. And then the next, I would say Tibetan for reading and writing. Okay, and then you could go on and talk about other languages, but those are the top ones. All right, then for pronunciation, from my experience, for me, as I mentioned, like, the Bantu language, well, with the clicks, Zulu, Xhosa. But again, I'm just a beginner, so I'll put that aside. And then I would say Vietnamese for sure, which is funny because I can actually speak Northern and Southern very well now. And even pass for momentarily as a native when somebody's not looking at me. But I overcome it. So I would say Vietnamese is very tough for pronunciation. Oh, yeah, Tibetan to a certain extent might be up there. And now for grammar for me, well, okay, Hungarian takes a cake. I never stayed Finnish, so I won't get into that one. On Slavic languages in general, Polish probably being number one, with the cases and everything. So yeah, I mean, people, when you have this, which is the hardest grammar wise, everybody has their own opinions. Again, it depends on what you're used to. So if you speak a Slavic language, which is besides Bulgarian and your language, with that don't have the cases, yeah, Macedonian, then yeah, and you do. So the cases aren't that you understand the whole concept and everything. It's just learning the differences between them because they're not always the same case amongst the languages. Yeah, I would address it that way. And then, again, I would say it depends on what your mother tongue is. And then people, this is real corner worms, but then is Esperanto the easiest language? And I said, not necessarily. I mean, for a Japanese speaker, Korean is going to be the easiest. But for Czech speaker, Slovak, for Polish speaker, who knows, Ukrainian, Czech, whatever. For Spanish, Portuguese, on and on. Right. So
English, Scots.
Yeah. They tend to say it's going to be the form of Dutch, like it's going to be Afrikaans, so it's going to be well,
yeah.
It didn't come to me now.
I think
yeah.
for sure there are easier things if you speak a language to learn the language that's closest to your language is going to be less effort because you don't have to memorize as many new words. You don't have to get used to as many new structures in the same way as, I mean, even like you say, Esperanto is.
Yeah, it's also the cultural aspect again. Like, for example, if you look at languages in Asia, it's funny that you see certain characteristics that are different from languages in Europe. For example, the lack of plural nouns. So in Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Thai, Lao, Vietnamese, Malay, Indonesian, etc. Plurals, it's a different concept. I mean, you don't, in some of those languages, there's no way that you can make a plural besides saying there are 3 books or 4 books or many books. But I forgot the word, I forgot my books, I forgot my book. It's going to be the same,
Yeah.
And so the concept of plurals, and then when when you get to the Chinese and the Vietnamese and Thai, etc., you don't have tenses. You only have aspects of verbs. So you don't have any conjugations. You don't have any inflections. There's no words change. And some people say, well, now how do you express this? How do you express that? And there are ways to do it. And once you know one, they do it a similar way, even though the languages aren't related.
Yeah.
and so you get used to it.
You definitely see those kind of linguistic similarities across other unrelated languages in Europe too. I mean, Bulgarian, Macedonian, Albanian, Romanian,
And Greek with,
well, no, the Greek doesn't do what I'm going to describe now.
oh, sorry.
They back end the definite article.
Yes, and in Norwegian.
And they do that in the Scandinavian, like in
Yeah,
Scandinavia with Swedish, Danish,
Yeah.
Norwegian, Icelandic,
Yeah.
Faroese. They will do that too. But they're related, obviously. Those languages are all Germanic, but the Albanian, Macedonian, Bulgarian, and Romanian are not. They're Indo European languages, but they're not very closely related, and they're not mutually intelligible. But they do have this aspect of grammar that kind of that cuts through them.
And you can't even call that a sprachbund because, and what you're pointing out, because it, it includes Scandinavia, etc. I thought you were going to, as you know, I thought you were going to talk about not using the infinitive. And
then that would include Greek.
That's a sprachbund.
Yeah, that would include Greek then, yes. And but the infinitive is included. The Romanians have an infinitive.
The Serbs do too. It's just a matter of choice, right?
Yeah, it depends on which variety you speak, how much and how far you use it.
Right.
But yeah, they do have it, and so yeah, I mean, there's only really for the lack of infinitive, you're talking Albanian, Macedonian, Bulgarian, and Greek. So it's a slightly different combination. Infinitive is the way.
Are we taking? Have you been giving me questions from the?
I've not got any questions through at the moment, but you're very welcome. If anybody has any questions, you're very, very welcome to use the Q&A box, and we'll weave the questions into the conversation as we get them. Otherwise, I can talk to Tim and ask him questions forever and a day.
Okay. So if there were questions, it would have been in the box here. Okay.
Yeah, I would have simply added them into the conversation.
Right.
So when it comes to what you choose and how you choose languages, because you do choose or seem to choose, or languages choose you. I don't know. Is there a rhyme and reason in how you move from language to language, or is it?
Well, like when you're talking to Stephen Crash and the ideals, you just want to learn every language. You hear a language, you get interested, you want to learn it. Obviously, that's impossible. So for me, it's usually a language which I can use in the near future. So as I mentioned, I learned Greek because I had an opportunity to go to a conference, and for academic conferences, we usually know at least 6 months in advance. I had time to prepare. Same with the Afrikaans. But I was always interested in those languages, but okay, here's my chance to actually learn it. And then it's through travel and activities. So and over the past decade, I've concentrated, been adding languages from the Himalayas. Now, Nepali has been the most important. Nepali is the #1 lingua franca, and this side of the Himalayas, not the Tibetan side, okay? More than Hindi, because actually it's the language spoken in Darjeeling and Sikkim, which is in India, but actually people were there are Nepali. Okay, so Nepali, and then the Tibetan related languages like Sherpa and Tamang, just language I'd use when trekking. I did multiple treks and every year in Nepal before COVID. And so it was been very exciting to speak these languages because the people, they just really surprised and extremely welcome. They've never met a foreigner, even Nepalis, and even Nepali guides who have been guiding tourists there for years often don't speak their language. And so I'm sitting in a restaurant and speaking at that time in Tamang, so Tamang guy. They're going, Wow, how'd you learn that? What are you doing? Yeah, they of course could have learned it, but they didn't. Yeah.
So you kind of you surprise people with some of your language choices because people aren't used to hearing them. But I think that is the thing that really unifies a lot of people who identify as a polyglot, in that there's sort of this intrinsic fascination with the unknown and trying to understand what's being said and where the words, what they're doing, where the words come from, what they're doing, and how they're being used. I think there is a natural thing.
Yes.
Vanessa asked actually which languages you usually dream in.
Okay, so it's a good question. It varies. I think the dominant one is English. My thoughts tend to be in English if I'm not thinking about something particular that happened in a certain language. So if I've been interacting in Japan with Japanese all day at the university or something, then my thoughts will carry on in Japanese for a while, but they tend to go back to English. And when I dreamed, and I have dreams where it involves languages where I am speaking a number of languages, and then there's always something happening. Somebody's surprised about it or not surprised, or kind of reflects real life situations, for a polyglot, when you run into a number of people from different countries and there's a group, and and you're going through different languages together. But I'm a lucid dreamer, meaning I can not only remember my dreams, but I know I'm dreaming when I'm dreaming. Not all the time, but I do have quite a lot of lucid dreams. And one strong lucid dream was in Poland. And after I'd been there for about 6 weeks for an intensive course in Polish, and of course I already knew Russian and Serbo-Croatian pretty well. And so in my dream, I was talking to Poles. And I realized that what they were saying was actually coming from my own mind. I created it, verbatim dialogue. And then I said, wow. And I started thinking about it. As I thought about it, I started coming out of my dream, because I become too aware that a lucid dreamer, when you become too aware, you back out of your dream. But then I said, oh, it's interesting. I'm going to go back into my dream and see more. Okay, and so I go back into my dream and loosen my mind some, and and I realize it's, and I've done this many times to check it out. It's true that you create everybody in your dream. So if somebody's speaking like a native, you also have that ability. Now you could also be fooling yourself, So you have to be very aware of it. Okay, so that's one thing that came out of dreams. So to me, dreams are very, very important in terms of my language experience because of that. Also, sometimes in a dream, I'll realize that I'm rusty. Somebody else was speaking quite well, but I can't. So the person, the me in the dream, I said, hey, it's in you, but you can't do it actively. You don't identify yourself as, somebody who can do that. You haven't convinced yourself when you're awake that you can do it,
You're super conscious of these kinds of things. That's really interesting to hear, actually. I've not heard anyone describe it in that way. It's a really interesting experience. Chanel wants to know, are there any new languages you're learning, or are you just keeping up the ones you've already studied before?
Okay, so I've written a book. I finished it last year, and it's a memoir. It's my life story. It's 60 chapters long. Some of the chapters are 3 or 4 pages. The long ones are 8 or 9 pages. So I've been translating it into a total of 27 languages, more in some than others. So I'm almost done with Italian. And that's because the person helping with Italian has really been very helpful. So, we meet on a weekly basis. So I had to get that chapter translated by the time we meet and such. And so it went quite quickly. So the ones that are pretty far advanced are Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Chinese, and my Slavic languages ones. Some of them, like Polish, I've gotten halfway done, but I have to rewrite it because I translated and then I hired a professional editor. And so the English version changed quite a bit. And so I had to go back and redo the chapters. But for like the Italian and Spanish, and I started translating those after the final product. I was translating for a while there. When I first started writing it, actually, I knew I wanted to write a book, about my life sooner or later. But at first, I was doing it for language practice. I would just, and it was Greek. I would just write something about myself and my past, and then write in Greek and have it corrected by the teacher, and she'd record it, and I practiced saying it. And then she said, "Well, no, this is fun." And she found it very interesting. So I said, "Okay, get more serious about it." So it just developed. Yeah. So okay. So am I learning new ones? So I'm maintaining by going back and translating and improving. It really pushes me to improve. And then you may wonder, now how can you translate in so many different languages? How can you build it? You'd be surprised at how well AI is doing recently. In some languages, you can do 5 different good sites. You can have Google, you can have what's it called, DeepL, and the Microsoft Bing, and others that you can use for that language. You can put in your sentence, and you can check, and you can cross references. You can look up, you can things like in reversal context. I use that one too. So there's AI has really helped me to construct some, in my translations. And I've done professional translation just on the side. I did once. I put my name in, they contacted me, and I wound up working like 40, 50 hours, 60 hours a week for a little while, about 6 years ago, on a project it was from Japanese to English. And they found out that I was really one of the few who actually who knew English well enough to make the final text okay, and knew Japanese well enough not to misunderstand. So I was correcting other people's. And so I earned 50,000 euros in a matter of a couple of months, working very hard. Yeah, and even back then, we would use a professional AI. Our site would be AI. We wouldn't just, in the past, you just translate from your head, but now you put out the text, from AI, and then you fix it. Yeah, that makes sense. And then my next step is to fix it with knowledgeable speakers.
Tim, I think we could carry this conversation on forever and ever, but unfortunately we have reached the end of the hour. And as fun as it is to talk to you and explore all of the really rich history of your language learning journey, we'll call it a day for today.
I appreciate you having me.
Talk again. Well, it's really good for you to join us on your European jaunt.
Yeah, I'm in southern Italy, everybody. So, and thank you all for your interest and coming to listen.